I'd like to extend a welcome to one and all to the replica Beothuk Village located behind the Mary Marsh Museum in Grand Falls. This is a project of the Exploits Valley Tourism Association that was that received assistance in funding and work from a various number of people. Most of the funding, I guess, came from Canada Manpower, our local Canada Employment Centre, and who realised a good idea when they saw it. And what we've tried to do here, I guess, is portray a piece of the Beothuk culture, not only for tourism purposes, but for locals alike, and try to provide an education, certainly complementary to the Mary Marsh Museum. And I think in looking back now in retrospect over the last couple of years, I think we've reached a goal, and the Beothuk Village is doing exactly what we set out to do. We've had approximately 7,000 people through the village this summer, and people who went through the Mary Marsh Museum and saw the Beothuk display in there, and then came out back and looked at pretty well what it was actually like in the times when the Beothuks existed along the Exploits River watershed. We try to keep the river heritage alive and emphasize the Exploits River. And as I said before, we've received a lot of help and a lot of assistance with the Beothuk Village. It came from a lot of areas. Certainly foremost would have to be our local Canada Employment Centre. Monetary assistance also came from the Environment Resources Management Association, IRMA, and from the Grand Falls Chamber of Commerce. We've had assistance from people like Don Locke, who assisted us with the construction of the replica village. We had assistance from Lloyd Seward in Bishop Falls, who constructed a replica Beothuk canoe, who did research and constructed the canoe pretty well to what a Beothuk canoe actually looked like. Also, the Grand Falls Chamber of Commerce donated some monetary assistance with regard to the construction of the village, and helped us install a chain link fence around the village for security reasons. We've certainly got a good, excellent facility here, and as I said before, not necessarily for tourism, but for the schools, but for the local people, to give an education on the Exploits River heritage. The Beothuks now are non-existent, the culture is gone, and hopefully not forgotten. Hopefully the Beothuk Village and the Mary Marsh Museum, and certainly Historic Resources Division in St. John's with the provincial government, will continue to provide us with information on the Beothuk culture, and keep our heritage, our historic resource heritage alive, and keep it alive and well for the people of Newfoundland, because over by and large, I guess we've got to have our natural heritage and our human heritage kept alive, and the Exploits River certainly portrays a lot of that, and we like to emphasize it whenever we can. And hopefully next year there'll be even more people through the Beothuk Village, and we'll continue to work hard and keep the thing in place, and keep everything alive and going, and I'd certainly encourage anybody to visit the Beothuk Village and certainly the Mary Marsh Museum.
The Mary Marsh Museum is the regional branch museum of the Newfoundland Museum System, a part of Historic Resources Division of Municipal and Provincial Affairs. The museum is dedicated to one of the last Beothuks, Mary Marsh, who died in 1820. The museum has a colorful and very informative permanent exhibit, as well as traveling exhibits from all across the country and North America. The museum was established for the entertainment and enjoyment, as well as the education, to the people of central Newfoundland and the province as a whole. We're open 12 months a year, 7 days a week, from 9 in the morning until 5 in the evening.
What we have here is a sketch of a map of the Exploits River that was done by Lieutenant John Cartwright in 1768. And at that time, Lieutenant Cartwright went up the river, and as you can see, from the estuary to Red Indian Lake, when compared in scale with a topographical map of today, leaves a lot to be desired with regard to scale. But it indicates all the tributaries upriver, and although some of the names are different and changed since that time, is still pretty accurate with regard to cartography work. Now you see the Bay of Exploits here, Charles's Brook, that haven't changed. Phillips Head here and Point of Bay, the names still remain the same. When we get into the estuary, Sandy Point, now that's called Wigwam Point, the local name for Sandy Point now. And Lower Sandy Point down here, well, that's still called Sandy Point, and Burnt Arm on the other side still remains the same. Norris Arm still remains the same, and Little Rattling Brook. When we come upriver, we notice here that Great Rattling Brook joined the Gander Bay Brook watershed here, but that's not necessarily true, although when you look at the topographical map, it comes pretty close. When you look in on Great Rattling Brook, and there's about a quarter of a mile in the difference where Careless Cove Brook breaks and runs into Gander Lake from where Rattling Brook runs down into the exploits, so there's about a quarter of a mile of a difference there in between. When we come on upriver, we can see the falls here, the Grand Falls, and it indicates a canoe path that was referred to in the writings of Captain David Buchan and William Epps Cormac. And that Indian path probably followed a route up over what is now High Street in Grand Falls, and came out, I guess, in what is known as in Grand Falls as Log Cabin Field, where the company stockpiles wood now for the Abitibi Price Mill. Coming upriver a little bit, you see Nimrod's Pool. Now today that's the pool located right off the golf course in Grand Falls. And Paradise Pool and Islands and Thunderbrook was formerly called Leech Brook, but some initiatives were taken in the last couple of years to have it renamed Thunderbrook. Mount Labour in Bain, we see here with the contour lines, is in actual fact Dodge's Hills. The Forbidden Ponds, we're getting in around Marianne Lake and Cornfield Lake and those areas. And Rangers River is named today Badger Brook, and that was a route used by the Beothuks to go into Seal Bay, Badger Bay area instead of coming down the exploits and carrying on out the Bay of Exploits and going around the Northern Head in Fortune Harbour and going over into New Bay. They could access New Bay waters this way by going out through Badger Brook waters and Twin Lake area. Twin Lake is not shown, by the way, on this map. When you come upriver, there's minor tributaries here, Crowfoot Brook and Omega Brook. We're looking at probably Harpoon Brook, and down here you look at what's called Stony Brook there, probably Noel Paul's Brook. And we get up here into this area, Lieutenant's Lake, which I guess Cartwright named after himself, Lieutenant Cartwright, in actual fact is Red Indian Lake today. So that pretty well covers the exploits, and there's some of the Gander waters in here. The Blue Mountains indicated here obviously as Mount Peyton, and Gander Lake was at that time he called Ayers Lake. And you look down here and it runs right down, although there's not much detail given on the Gander waters, it runs right down into Gander Bay. And a lot of it was taken from information received by local fishermen and furriers at the time that Cartwright was here, and the information was just applied. He didn't actually travel all those places. Mostly what Cartwright did was come up the main stem of the exploits to Lieutenant's Lake or Red Indian Lake as it is now. And as I said, most of the information was obtained from local fishermen and furriers of the time he was here. Little Rattling Brook indicates the ponds, and it runs back pretty well to the Blue Mountains or Mount Peyton, and that's pretty accurate just from information that was derived from the locals. Looking back at the Grand Falls and downriver from Grand Falls and certainly above Grand Falls, Cartwright did indicate the various Beothuk campsites that he observed on the way up the river, and this map that Cartwright did was the first officially commissioned map of the Exploits River watershed in central Newfoundland.
Our understanding of Beothuk culture stems well into prehistory. The Beothuks, as we know them, before the time of Cabot and Cartier, their culture looked pretty much like the material you'd find here at the Merry March on display. Their arrowheads were small, triangular, with deep side notches. They had skin scrapers made of various types of chert. From about 1,000 years ago, prior to the time of Cabot, Beothuk material culture changed through a number of cultural complexes. The most common identified by archaeologists are the Little Passage complex, the Cowhead complex, and the Beaches complex. The Little Passage being the more recent. In fact, the carriers of that culture are the people that historians and ethnologists would call the Beothuks. And as you can see here, this is the type of toolkit or the types of artifacts that the Beothuks would have been using to get along in everyday life. They're arrowheads, spear points, knives, and they're all made of fine-grained cherts, and some are fairly colorful cherts. Their culture changed significantly with the introduction of European materials. They eventually give up entirely the use of stone for their tools, and they move over into using iron and copper, and taking advantage of other European materials like fishing hooks, sailcloth for their wigwams, and stone or iron axes as opposed to using stone axes. By the mid-18th century, Beothuk culture had changed significantly in their use of raw materials to make their tools. They've totally replaced or transferred their tool technology from a Stone Age technology to an Iron Age technology. They've given up stone, bone, and to a large degree skins and bark, even though some of those elements still remained in their culture. As you can see here, this tin bucket or tin container is nearly identical in the folding pattern to the folding pattern that they would have used for a birch bark container, except it's made out of tin. It's the total transference of information on from one material to another. Their arrowheads and spear points are no longer made from stone. They're made from iron. Some of these were trade iron that was brought up by David Buckins in hopes of establishing friendly relations with the Beothuks. Deer spears and axes were part of the material he had brought along to the Exploits River. But in most cases, the Beothuks were pilfering iron from fishing stations along the coast. They were taking advantage of the nails and other pieces of iron that would have been a normal part of a fishing station. They would heat up the nail and pound it on an anvil stone, breaking off the head, and then they would shape it into the point or what they would like to make out of it. They would dismantle traps to make into spear points or harpoon end blades. This harpoon end blade is a combination of both elements of their culture. They're still using a traditional bone harpoon head, while the blade is made out of iron. In fact, this is a part of a trap, which was probably pilfered from a trap, much like you'd find here. At some point, they did have contact with some Europeans on a more friendly basis. There are examples from some of the Beothuk sites in the mouth of Notre Dame Bay, which have trade beads, which were quite common in the 18th century in the fur trading industry. Other elements of the Beothuk culture that you'd find are knives and fish hooks, which have either been straightened out to use as awls or some other pointed implement. By the 18th century, even though they had access to a lot of European material, they still depended to some degree on the natural raw materials. You'd find references to wigwams that had sailcloth as well as having caribou hide. I would suspect that the Beothuk canoe is the one of the main elements that didn't have a transference from European material, because it was light and efficient and probably easily made. So we think that they maintained a traditional form of manufacturing the canoes. But to a large degree, most of the elements of Beothuk material culture had changed, well, almost entirely from a Stone Age to an Iron Age type of existence. This is a reconstruction of a Beothuk cave burial. In fact, it's a cave burial that was found in 1886 in Dark Tickle, Notre Dame Bay, western Notre Dame Bay. It was a young child who had been placed in a caribou hide bag, which, after closer examination, it turned out that the skin bag was the legging of a woman's garment. A number of objects were placed in the grave with the child. The wooden doll you can see here, some toy birch bark containers, an extra pair of moccasins, and some extra clothing. The grave was covered with ochre. All the implements were covered with ochre. All the grave goods were covered with the red colored ochre. The grave would have had a canopy of birch bark, which would have again been covered with red ochre, and then it would have gravel on top of it to keep out small animals and rodents.
This is a smokehouse. This was used to smoke their meat and fish to preserve it, and their skins, which they made their clothing out of. It was constructed of 3 walls of vertical poles, which were left open, and they faced the prevailing winds. And the 4th wall, as you can see, is filled in with moss, so it contained the winds. The combination of the prevailing winds coming in through these 3 sides and the downdraft created through the hole in the top would cause the smoke from the central fire to circulate inside the structure. The skins were stretched across racks that were about 18 inches from the walls, and the meat and fish were put on racks that surrounded the fire.
Here we have a winter wigwam. This type of structure was found mainly in the interior during the fall and winter months. It consisted of 8 sides, all built in vertical fashion. Moss would be packed between each log for insulation reasons. Dirt would also be piled up along the bottom, inside and outside, for insulation reasons and also to protect themselves against the flooding interior waters. It would be covered in red ochre because it was a spiritual belief that it protected them from the Red Indian Devil. Inside, it would be hollowed out around the fire to cause a draft which would drive the smoke straight up through the opening in the center of the roof. That way, nothing would catch on fire. Boughs would be laid down in these hollows and covered in animal skins for sleeping purposes. They would sleep about 30 people in one of these structures, consisting of 2 or 3 families. They would also keep 3 large stones around the fire, which would be used as anvils to make spearheads and arrowheads. The roof would be made so that logs went from the top of the walls and was supported by a center spruce ring tied on using spruce roots. 6 inches of moss would be tracked between each log and then covered in 3 layers of birch bark in tile-like fashion, so that the rain wouldn't seep down between the cracks. Here we have a storage pit, who's the same thing as a modern-day freezer. What they would do is they'd dig a hole into the ground 4 feet, line it with birch bark, and painted in red ochre. But then they would make a cover out of smaller logs and birch bark tied together using spruce roots. This is where they would keep their meats, berries, eggs, and fish which they collected off the coast during spring and summer. Inside that you have a cooking fire, what they use for cooking their meats, fish, and other food items. And beyond that you have some caribou antlers, and if they never ate the bone marrow inside of the antlers, they would draw them out and chip away at them to make such devices as needles, necklaces, and cooking utensils.
This is the summer wigwam. It was used as a temporary structure during the summer months. In the spring of the year, the Beothuk Indians would migrate to the coast where they would spend the remainder of the summer fishing, hunting seals and other sea animals, gathering birds' eggs and other food. It was constructed of an interior frame of poles tied at the top with spruce roots. Large sheets of birch bark were placed over these poles, and then the outer trees, as you can see, would hold the bark in place. It was used as a single-family dwelling, and they could construct it in as little as an hour, and so would put one up wherever they decided to spend the night. As you can see, the door was situated on the far side to face the morning sun. This is what the Beothuks used as their early alarm clock. This is the sweat bath. It was made of an interior frame of pine saplings or spruce saplings. The outside was made of either caribou skins or, as you can see here, birch bark. It was sewed neatly with the spruce roots, or also you can see some wire which the Beothuks would have obtained from the Europeans. It was used as a type of sauna. They would heat the rocks with a fire, let the fire burn out. Once the rocks were hot, they would get inside, pull this down over them, pour water on the rocks, and get a steam bath. It was used to alleviate the pain of arthritis, rheumatism, and also to cure fevers. It's also thought that it did have some spiritual significance.
This is a winter wigwam as well. It's much the same as the 8-sided one that you saw earlier, except this one has 4 sides, so it was probably just used for a single family or for a newly married couple. Other than that, the construction is the same.
This was a Beothuk burial site. As you can see, the Beothuks would bury them in natural rock forms like this one, or in natural rock caves. The body would be placed on its right side in the fetal position. It would be painted with a mixture of red ochre and grease, and almost mummified in the birch bark. As you can see, many of the person's possessions would be buried with them, as the Beothuks believed extensively in life after death. When there were no caves available, they would simply dig a shallow hollow in the ground, line it with the birch bark, lay the body in, and cover it over with a mound of rocks.
Here we have a replica of the Beothuk canoe. It was constructed by Mr. Lloyd Seward. The inside of the canoe, it's made of an inner framework of aspen, and the outside is covered with large sheets of birch bark held together with the pitch, and the 2 sides are sloped upward for the overlapping of the waves so the water doesn't get on the inside, and the front and the back also, so it will ride the rapids of the water a little easier. And here they use the rope in which the Beothuk Indians would use the spruce roots. Here we have a rock-based wigwam. It was used in the fall and winter months when the ground was frozen or hard. They couldn't insert the poles into the ground, so they would use a rock-based wigwam to hold the structure in its place. It's made of an inner framework of poles. Then they take large sheets of birch bark, much the same as modern-day tiles, and they sheet it around the inner framework of poles. Then they place larger poles outside to hold the birch bark in its place. Okay, in the center of the wigwam, they would place a fire and they would sit around the fire. And also at the ceiling, in the center of the wigwam where the poles would meet, they would leave the hole vacant for the smoke to escape from the fireplace. They would line the hole with the spruce roots, and they would also put clay on the outside so the birch bark doesn't catch on fire. And inside of the wigwam, they use spruce roots and to tie the poles in its place, and the moss as a type of insulation.
We're here now on a hill overlooking the Exploits River, located in the Beothuk Village. And as I referred to earlier on Lieutenant Cartwright's map, the Indian path around the falls, the portage that the Beothuks used, and was referred to in Captain Buchan's and Mr. Cormac's writings, in actual fact, under research, ran fairly close to where we're now standing. And in my closing remarks now, I'd like to thank Central Cable certainly for the great job that they did, and certainly what'll turn out to be good promotional material for the Beothuk Village. And I'd encourage one and all, and invite you one and all next year, if you find the time, to come and certainly take a look in the Mary March Museum and enjoy that facility, and then come right out back and have a look at the replica Beothuk Village. It'll certainly be a treat, and we look forward to seeing you all next year.
We love